They thought the quartered meatballs at the Christmas dinner were the worst sign that Trey was running the company into the ground. They didn't notice the one-page renewal notice he forgot to send me. The day I am thinking of was December 24th, 2025, a Wednesday. I was 64 years old. I was sitting at the desk on the 5th floor of the building at 6th and Walnut in downtown Des Moines, where I had sat for most of my working life. I opened the second drawer on the right. I took out the red ballpoint pen. I wrote one date on the wall calendar above the desk, January 1st, 2026. No note next to it, no asterisk, no reminder, just the date by itself in red. I had written that same date on the wall calendar in that same office every December since 1996. Nobody had ever asked me what it was for. 8 days later, the deadline would pass. By the time anyone in Trey's office noticed, it would already be too late. I'm Vernon Walker, Halverson's department stores, 38 years. I came in through the receiving dock at the flagship store, and I never left. For most of those years, my title was something else. For the last 2, it was Director of Real Estate Operations. I was hired in April of 1988. I was 26. Roy Halverson Sr., the founder's son, was the man who signed my paperwork. He was 46 that spring. He shook my hand on the receiving dock at 6 in the morning, told me where the broom was, and walked back to the freight elevator. The chain at that time was 9 stores across central Iowa. By the time he was done, it was 11. I had been married 4 years to Lynette Bell when I started at the store. We had met at a Drake University extension class in the spring of 1983. She was 20. She played the piano at her parents' Lutheran church. We bought a brick bungalow on 42nd Street in Beaverdale, on the north side of Des Moines, the year after I joined the company. We have been in that house ever since. Allison was born in 1986, Reed in 90, Brennan in 98. They are 39, 35, and 27 now. Allison is a hospital chaplain at Mercy One. She and her husband Daniel have 2 children, Maya, who turned 5 in March, and Theo, who is still 1. Reed sells crop insurance for FBL Financial out in West Des Moines. Brennan is finishing a master's in landscape architecture at Iowa State, up in Ames. Lynette taught elementary school music at Beaverdale Elementary for 31 years. She retired 3 years ago. She still plays the piano on Sunday mornings at St. John's Lutheran. None of my children work for Halversons. I never asked any of them to. That was the deal. I gave the company my career. They got to grow up without it. I spent the first 22 years of my time at Halversons walking the floors, receiving, men's furnishings, store fixtures, building maintenance, real estate operations. The stockroom phone in the basement of the flagship still has my extension scratched into the metal. By the time Roy named me Chief Operating Officer in January of 2010, there was no hallway, no freight elevator, no service entrance, no boiler room, and no vendor contract in any of the 11 stores that I hadn't worked through with my own hands. But the thing that turned out to matter most was a conversation Roy and I had in the fall of 1996. I was 35 then. I had been at the store 8 years. He brought me into his office on a Tuesday in September. He shut the door. He told me his estate planning attorney was putting something together he wanted me to understand. He was selling the building, the 6-story brick at 6th and Walnut, the one he was running the whole chain out of. He was selling it to me and Lynette, personally. $850,000. I would carry the bank loan. He would co-sign it on a friendship basis the bank treated as comfort rather than guarantee. Mavis Howard, the chain's outside counsel since 1994, would draft the deed and the master lease that would let the company keep operating out of it. I asked him why. He said, "Vernon, if my kids ever sell this place out from under us, I want one person who can stop them, and that's you." I brought the paperwork home that night. Lynette read it twice at the kitchen table. She set it down. She looked at me. She said, "Vernon, you signed that paperwork, and the 4 of us are stuck with whatever happens to that building. Are you sure?" I said I was sure. We signed in Mavis's conference room at Balin McCormick on September 16th, 1996. The mortgage took us 20 years. We paid it off in March of 2016, free and clear. What it cost was the evenings. The bachelor's degree at Drake I had started in 82 and given up on for tuition reasons came back together piece by piece on the Halversons tuition program. Evening classes, 4 nights a week, 10 years to finish. I got my diploma in 92 in a folder mailed to the house. house. Lynette put it on the wall in the hallway. It is still there. The master lease Mavis drafted that September was a standard 30-year commercial lease, the kind any retail tenant would expect for a flagship building it didn't own. $42,000 a month in base rent, with annual escalators tied to inflation. The lessor was Lynette and me, as the personal owners. The lessee was Halverson's Department Stores Incorporated. Mavis built 2 10-year renewal options into it on the company's behalf. Anyone in retail would expect the chain to want them. A flagship store cannot relocate easily, and the company had built 3 generations of customer habit around the address. The original 30-year term, the one we signed on September 16, 1996, was set to expire on June 30, 2026. If you've ever been told you're not ready by someone who couldn't do your job for 5 minutes, you know where this goes. Like and subscribe. The renewal options had a condition on them. Mavis had drafted it carefully, because that is what good real estate lawyers do. Section 4(b) of the master lease required the tenant, Halverson's, to give Lynette and me written notice of intent to exercise the first 10-year renewal option at least 180 days before the original term expired. 180 days before June 30, 2026 was January 1, 2026. If the notice was not delivered by that date, in writing, the renewal option lapsed irrevocably. The lease wound down on its original schedule. The chain had 6 months from the deadline to vacate the building. There was no remedy in the contract. There was no extension by implication. There was no late notice cure. Mavis had drafted it to be clean. That is why I had been writing one date on the wall calendar in my office every December since 1996, the same date, January 1st, 2026. I wrote it in red pen on the kind of wall calendar my mother used when I was a kid, the kind with one big number per page. I never put a note next to it. I never had to. Lynette knew what it was. Roy knew what it was. Mavis knew what it was. Nobody else at Halverson's needed to. It was my job, after all, to keep the company's real estate calendar. If the company ever wanted to renew, the company would tell me. That was how a real estate department operated in any retail chain in America. The tenant initiated the renewal. The landlord did not chase it. For 30 years, the question of who would chase it never came up, because Roy was running the company. In June of 2022, Roy was 80. He had been running Halverson's on his feet for 45 years, and the doctor had told him to slow down. He moved to a winter condo in Sun Valley, Idaho, with his wife Eunice, and announced he was semi-retiring. He named his nephew Trey Halverson Chief Executive Officer. Trey was 28. He was the only son of Roy's younger brother Earl, who had died in a hunting accident in northern Wisconsin in November of 2005, when Trey was 12. Roy and Eunice took Trey in alongside their own 3 children and raised him through high school. By 2018, Trey had a Wharton MBA and 2 years of analyst work at a Chicago consulting boutique. He started at Halverson's in 2021 in a vague new role called Director of Strategic Initiatives that the Chief Financial Officer had not been able to find the budget line for. 18 months later, he was in Roy's chair. He was driving a leased Genesis SUV by then, with the Brunello Cucinelli quarter zip and the IWC Schaffhausen watch and the white Common Project sneakers. And he had hired 3 of his Wharton classmates as vice presidents. In January of 2024, a Tuesday morning, around 9, I came in to find that my parking spot had been restriped. The reserved sign with my name was gone. There was a sign with another name. I drove out, parked in the public ramp across the street, and walked back. By 10, there was an email in my inbox from Trey's office. The subject line was Operational Refinement. The email said the Chief Operating Officer role had been folded into the Chief Executive's office, and that I would now be Director of Real Estate Operations, reporting to a Vice President named Cody Brooks, who had not yet been hired. My compensation was unchanged. My direct reports were not. I read the email. I did not reply. A month later, Roy was back for his annual 10-day winter visit. He always took me to coffee at the Hotel Fort Des Moines. On the second day of every visit, we sat at the corner table by the window. He ordered black coffee. I ordered the same. He stirred nothing into it. He set the cup down and looked at me for a long time. He said, "Vernon, are you all right with this?" I said, "Roy, I'm fine. That's his prerogative." Roy was quiet for 15 seconds. The waiter came over and asked if we wanted anything else, and Roy waved him off without looking at him. Then he said, "Vernon, the 1996 lease." I nodded. He said, "All right." We finished the coffee. We did not talk about it again for 2 years. 2 years happened the way they were going to happen. By the end of 2023, comp sales were down 4.7%. Trey announced an initiative called Halverson's 2030, hired 3 of his Wharton classmates as vice presidents, strategy, marketing, and digital, and began de-emphasizing the chain's mid-tier private label apparel in favor of premium streetwear partnerships. Spencer Halverson, Roy's eldest grandson, took the marketing chair. By the end of 2024, comp sales were down 8.1%. 2 long-tenured women's apparel buyers, Linda Stewart and Karen Morgan, both of whom I had known for 15 years, left for Junkers and Von Maur. The blinds at the Walnut Street headquarters started closing during the day and summer for what Trey's office called energy efficiency, and the floor I worked on took on a permanent dim look. By the third quarter of 2025, comp sales were down 11.4%. The Sharpie markers in the supply room had been replaced with off-brand markers. The monthly comp sales chart that had been posted in the employee break rooms of every store since 1991 was taken down in August. According to Trey's communications coordinator, people were spending too much time looking at the chart and not enough time selling. Cody Brooks had been hired in March of 2025 as vice president of human resources. His LinkedIn page, the week the hire was announced, listed 3 prior turnaround engagements at 3 companies that all underwent restructuring during his tenure. Trey did not appear to have noticed the pattern. I noticed it. I did not say anything. In September, Cody's office sent a chain-wide survey asking what range of temporary salary adjustment we could each accommodate, if such an adjustment were necessary. I did not respond. In October, the cleaners stopped emptying the desk trash on the 4th floor of headquarters. We carried our bins to the kitchen at the end of each day. In November, the morale committee ran a perks poll asking whether we'd prefer lactose-free milk or decaf coffee in the kitchens. I voted for neither and wrote in the margin, whichever is cheaper. The Bridge Room is the 6th floor restaurant at the Flagship store. It looks out at the Center Street Bridge over the Des Moines River. It has hosted the Halverson staff Christmas dinner every year since 1973. The tradition has included a 4-tier shrimp tower since 1976. Lance Cooper has managed the Bridge Room since 1992. On Monday, December 22, 2025, the staff Christmas dinner was held. The budget per head was set by Trey's office at $1.50. Lance had worked 2 days to make it look acceptable. The menu was spaghetti with marinara, rotini with quartered meatballs, iceberg salad with store-brand Italian dressing, and ice water. There was no shrimp tower. There had been one as late as 2021. I attended. I did not eat the meatballs. On the way out, Lance and I shook hands at the door. He said, "We do what we can with what we got." Then he walked back to the kitchen. On Wednesday, December 31st, I left the office at 5 o'clock. We had Allison and Daniel and the kids at the kitchen table for an early New Year's Eve dinner. Lynette had made a pot roast. Maya was 4. Theo was a year old. Maya fell asleep on the rug in the living room with one shoe still on. Theo slept on Lynette's shoulder in the kitchen. We were in bed by 10. At 12:01 in the morning of Thursday, January 1st, 2026, the renewal notice deadline passed. I was asleep next to Lynette. Trey was at a New Year's Eve party in Naples, Florida. The office at 6th and Walnut was closed for the holiday week. No notice had been delivered. On Monday morning, January 5th, I drove the Camry to the Walnut Street ramp at 8:25 and walked up to the 5th floor. The wall calendar over my desk was still showing December. The January 1st entry was at the bottom of the page in red pen. I turned the calendar to January. I sat down. I opened the company's real estate management system and started the year's first quarterly portfolio review for the 11-store chain. I did not say anything to anybody about the deadline. Roy and Eunice flew in on the 12th for his annual 10-day visit. Eunice came along that year because Roy had been complaining about the cold air at the Sun Valley condo, and she wanted to see whether his lungs were what was wrong. He kept his usual schedule: morning meetings with Trey, afternoon meetings with the senior team. He did not come up to the 5th floor on his first day, or his second, or his third. He came up on the morning of Wednesday, January 21st. He sat down across the desk from me. He had black coffee in a paper cup. He set it down. He looked at the wall calendar above me, January, with no entries, for a long time. Then he looked at me. He said, "Vernon, the 1st." I nodded. He said, "Has anyone I shook my head slowly. He was quiet for 15 seconds. Then he said, "All right, I'll need 90 days, Vernon." I said, "Take 6 months." He said, "6 months is what we have." He stood up, picked up the coffee cup, and walked out of the office. I had been on the agenda for a slot called Operational Decay Update for the fourth quarter strategic review meeting since the previous Wednesday. I had asked for the slot by email. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday, January 27th, 2026 at 10 in the morning in the fourth floor boardroom. I built a 14-point memo over the holiday week. Item 1 was the 11.4% comp sales drop. Item 2 was the vendor terms. 11 of 31 suppliers on cash on delivery as of December 31st. Item 3 was the 2 long-tenured buyers gone. Item 4 was the $50 per head Christmas dinner budget. Item 5 was Lancôme and Clinique giving written notice of consideration of departure. Items 6 through 13 covered real estate, lease economics, store traffic, payroll, working capital trends, and the bridge room's quarterly financials. Item 14, I left off the deck. Item 14 was the one Roy and I already knew about. I presented for an hour and 18 minutes. The senior team, the chief financial officer, the vice president of operations, Spencer in his marketing chair, the vice president of stores, and Cody Brooks sat through it. Trey sat at the head of the table with both hands on his coffee cup and did not interrupt me until I was done. When I finished, Trey set the cup down. He looked around the table. He looked at me. He said, "Vernon, with respect, you've been with the company a long time, but the world has moved on. We're not running my grandfather's department store anymore. The bridge room budget is the bridge room budget. Move on." The room was quiet. Spencer studied his laptop. Cody studied his. Trey called me into his office at 11:22. He shut the door. He walked to his desk and stood behind it. He said, "Vernon, I think it's time we talked about retirement. 6 months. Generous package. Quiet exit. You can leave on a high note." Then he said, "Don't think too long." I said, "Trey, I appreciate the offer. I'll think about it." That was the conversation. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table while Lynette chopped onions for soup. I told her about the meeting in the boardroom and the conversation in Trey's office afterward. I told her I was not going to take Trey's package. She said, "Vernon, have you talked to Roy about January 1st? I said, "Roy already talked to me." She nodded once and went back to chopping onions. Roy flew back to Des Moines on Tuesday, February 3rd. He did not stay at the Hotel Fort Des Moines that trip. He stayed at Bell-Inn McCormick in a small windowless conference room on the 7th floor of the Davis Brown Tower, where Mavis Howard had been outside corporate counsel since 1994. He stayed there for 2 days. He went through the 1996 master lease, the corporate bylaws, particularly Section 6.2 on the chair's authority to call special meetings, the Halverson family trust documents, and the 5-person board's voting structure. Roy held 51% of the voting shares through the family trust. Eunice held 18%. Roy's 3 biological children held 17% combined. Trey held 14%. On the evening of Thursday, February 5th, Roy hosted a private dinner in the small banquet room at the Hotel Fort Des Moines. Eunice was there. So were his 3 biological children. So was Spencer, his eldest grandson, Trey's classmate, the current vice president of marketing. Roy walked the table through the lease, the deadline, the closed blinds, the comp sales slide, the meatballs, and the survey. He laid out Section 4B and what it meant. By the time the entrees arrived, his 3 biological kids had told him he had their votes. By coffee, Eunice had told him the same. Spencer hesitated. He said he wanted to think. After dinner, Roy walked Spencer out to the elevator. He thanked him for coming. He did not invite him to the next conversation. On Sunday morning, February 8th, a courier delivered a sealed envelope to Trey's house in West Des Moines. The envelope contained the formal Section 6.2 notice of a special meeting of the Board of Directors of Halverson's Department Stores Incorporated, to be held in the 4th floor boardroom at 6th and Walnut on Monday, February 9th at 9 in the morning. The agenda, the notice said, would be distributed at the meeting. Trey opened the envelope sometime that afternoon. At 10 that night, he called his lawyer, a Des Moines deals attorney named Doug Anderson. Doug had 11 hours to prepare. At 8:45 Monday morning, the printed agenda was placed in front of Trey at the boardroom boardroom table. Item 1 was the lapsed renewal option on the flagship store building. He had 15 minutes before the meeting started. Roy chaired. Mavis sat to his right with a court reporter she had retained. The 4 other directors sat along the table, Eunice and Roy's 3 biological children. Spencer was not in the room. He had not been invited as a director. He had not been invited at all. Trey was in the room with Doug Anderson. Cody Brooks was in the room as company human resources observer. The chief financial officer was in the room as company finance observer. I was not in the room. I was on the 5th floor doing my quarterly real estate review for the 11-store portfolio. Roy presented the timeline. Mavis presented the legal analysis. The slides moved from the founding of the chain to the 1996 estate planning sale of the flagship building, to the deed in the personal names of Vernon and Lynette Walker at the Polk County Recorder, to the master leases section 4B, to the 180 days, to the deadline that had passed at 12:01 on the morning of January 1st. At about 8 minutes past 10, Trey looked at Mavis, and then at the deed on the screen, and then at Roy. He said, "Wait, Vernon owns the building?" Nobody answered him. The room was quiet for a long time. At 10:14 in the morning, Roy called the vote on the motion to remove Trey Halverson as Chief Executive Officer of Halverson's Department Stores Incorporated. The room had been quiet for the 6 minutes since Trey's realization. Eunice voted yes. Roy's 3 biological children voted yes. Spencer Halverson abstained. Trey voted no. The motion carried 4-1. Roy stood up. He said, "I'll take the chair until the search is done." Mavis recorded the resolution. The court reporter recorded everything. Mavis offered Trey a seat on the board at the family's discretion. Trey looked at Doug Anderson. Doug looked back. Trey said no. Roy did not insist. Doug did not insist either. Trey took his briefcase, his iPad, and the ID card around his neck. He walked out of the boardroom and rode the elevator down to the parking ramp. Doug followed him as far as the lobby. 2 hours later, the chain's general counsel had Trey's resignation letter in the inbox. By the end of the day, his email account had been deactivated, his keys had been collected, and the Genesis SUV's parking spot in the executive ramp had been restriped for the next person. At 11, Roy called the senior team into the boardroom. He sat at the head of the table where Trey had sat 70 minutes earlier. He said the chain was in stabilization. He said no one was being fired today. He said the chain would honor every existing commitment to vendors, customers, and employees. He took questions for 15 minutes and sent everyone back to work. I learned all of this from Mavis later. While the room was voting on the 4th floor, I was on the 5th, doing the year's first quarterly real estate review for the 11-store chain. At 10:42, the phone on my desk rang. The call came from the chair's office on the 4th floor. I picked it up. Roy was on the line. He said, "Vernon, come up. We're talking about the new lease." I saved the spreadsheet. I picked up the paper cup. I walked to the elevator. I pressed 4. The 4th floor was quiet. The boardroom door was open. Roy was at the head of the table. Mavis was on her phone in the corner. The rest of the chairs were empty. Roy looked up. He said, "Sit down, Vernon." I sat down at the table. Roy slid a folder across to me. The folder was the 1996 lease. Becky Phillips had been Lynette's and my personal real estate attorney since the building mortgage cleared in March of 2016. She had handled the deed clearing paperwork in her late 30s and had been on a small annual retainer for personal property matters ever since. I called her on her cell phone from the boardroom hallway at 10:45 Monday morning. She drove over to Bellin McCormick at 1 o'clock and met me in the conference room on the 7th floor of the Davis Brown Tower. Mavis brought a fresh pot of coffee. Becky brought a yellow legal pad and a calculator. The negotiation took 9 working days. We worked on it most evenings. Becky and I at our kitchen table in Beaverdale. Becky and Mavis in Mavis's office during the day. All 3 of us together when something needed signing or arguing. Lynette read every draft. On the 7th day, Becky and Mavis disagreed about whether the consumer price index escalator should ratchet annually or compound. Becky wanted ratchet. Mavis wanted compound. They had been working until 8 at night for 2 weeks, and they were not going to settle it. Lynette had been sitting at the kitchen table the whole evening. She set down her tea. She said, "Compound until the second renewal, then ratchet." Both of them looked up. Both of them said yes. It went to the final draft. The final terms were a 30-year base term with 2 10-year renewal options at fair market rent. The new rent was $61,500 a month, indexed to consumer price index. The chain paid Lynette and me a lump sum of $235,000 to bridge the 6-month gap from July 1st through the end of the original lease, since the original term had wound down to 0 on June 30th, and the new term began the next day. Becky and Mavis signed across the conference table at 4 o'clock on Wednesday, February 18th. Lynette and I signed our copy in the corner over a paper cup of office coffee. Lynette was wearing the same blue blouse she had worn at the closing in 1996. She did not point it out. She just signed in her teacher's careful cursive on the line where Becky had drawn the tab. Mavis walked us to the elevator. She shook Lynette's hand at the elevator door. She said, "30 years, Lynette." Lynette said, "30 years." Mavis nodded. Roy moved fast. He hired Heydrich and Struggles out of their Chicago office in the first week of March to run the search for the next chief executive officer. He gave Lance Cooper full authority over the bridge room budget and a directive that the spring menu would resume the chain's 1973 norm. Lance announced the spring menu on Wednesday, March 18th. The lunch service Shrimp Tower came back the same day. Trey took a position with a Chicago consulting firm in the last week of March. The title was Director of Retail Strategy. He did not return calls from any Iowa retail trade publication that contacted him for comment. The Des Moines Register ran 2 paragraphs on him on a Tuesday inside the business section. The Iowa Retail Federation removed his name from the speakers list of its summer conference and did not ask him for a replacement topic. He did not call Roy. He did not call Eunice. He did not call me. By the end of March, his name had been removed from the chain's website. His Genesis SUV had been turned into the leasing company, and the 3 Wharton classmates he had hired had quietly begun looking for next roles. The blinds on the 4th floor of the Walnut Street headquarters started opening again the morning Roy moved into the corner office. Spencer kept his closed. He was on the way out anyway. On Tuesday, April 7th, Roy announced Alan Carter as the incoming chief executive officer. Alan was 56. He had been a regional general manager at Boscov's for 11 years. He had grown up in Council Bluffs and spent his summers in central Iowa visiting an aunt. He had 2 kids in college, no political LinkedIn presence, and a reputation for closing the lights and locking the door at the end of every day. Roy had liked him from the second sentence of the first interview. Eunice had taken Alan and his wife to dinner the night Heydrich brought him over. The hire took 1 dinner and a phone call. Spencer Halverson resigned as vice president of marketing the same Tuesday afternoon. He was replaced by an outside hire from Pendleton, Oregon, the following week. On Wednesday, April 8th, Lancôme and Clinique confirmed in writing that they would not be moving from the flagship's main floor. By Friday, April 17th, vendor terms had been restored to net 30, with 23 of the original 31 suppliers. The other 8 were on shortened cycles that Mavis was confident would normalize by the end of June. Alan Carter started as chief executive officer on Monday, April 20th. His first morning, he walked the entire flagship, from the receiving dock at 6 in the morning, where Roy had hired me 38 years before, up through every department, ending on the 6th floor at the bridge room. Lance Cooper made him a cup of coffee. They talked for 40 minutes. Cody Brooks accepted a severance package the same day and was gone by lunch. Alan came up to my office on the 5th floor at 4 in the afternoon on his first day. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the wall calendar above the desk. Then he sat down across from me and asked me to walk him through the lease. On Sunday, April 12th, 2026, at 5:30 in the evening, Lynette and I drove the Camry to the Walnut Street ramp, walked across the street, and rode the freight elevator to the 6th floor of the flagship. Allison and Daniel were already there with Maya and Theo. The hostess at the door of the bridge room had been seating people in that restaurant since 1996. She did not ask me for my name. She picked up 6 menus and walked us to table 7 by the window facing the Center Street Bridge, the way she had every time we had come for a Sunday dinner since our oldest was a baby. Lynette was wearing the same blue blouse from the February signing. She had not said anything about it when she put it on that afternoon. I had noticed. The Center Street Bridge lights came on at 6. They lit the edge of the table. Allison ordered the pot roast for herself and Daniel because the pot roast was what her mother always made on a Sunday, and you didn't change a thing that worked. The kids had pasta with butter. Maya was halfway through a child's portion when she looked at me over the candle in the middle of the table. She said, "Grandpa, why do we always sit at this table?" Lynette set her fork down and watched me. I thought about the answer for a long time. Then I said, "Maya, when you're older, I'll show you." She thought about that. She said, "How much older?" I said, 20 years. She said, "That's a long time." I said, "It is." Theo was eating a meatball. It was this year, intact. After dinner, Lynette and I rode the elevator down to the freight ramp at the back of the building. She took my arm. We walked across the street to the Camry. The lights of the Center Street Bridge were still on behind us when I pulled out of the ramp. The renewal notice was a single page of paper. It had to be sent by January 1st, 2026. No one sent it. I didn't have to do a thing. Funny thing about a renewal option. It doesn't lapse the day a man tears it up. It lapses the day nobody remembers to write the letter. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and let me know what you think in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and ring that notification bell to get alerts about new stories like this one. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.